straightness in the horse. And in context, a little bit of what we're doing with research. We don't have all the answers yet. You know, some of what I tell you is just the questions that I have. But I've entitled this talk not just straightness, but straightness and symmetry, because I think those two things are intimately sort of woven together. And you know, if you came in thinking that straightness is just having the horse aligned like that diagram there, then that's not exactly what we're talking about. Straightness, I think, goes a long way beyond just the alignment of the horse's body. So, what is there beyond the alignment of the horse's body? The alignment really we think of in terms of the hind feet following in the tracks of the forefeet, and that's fine when the horse is moving on a straight line, but of course when the horse is on a turn or a curve, we still have to have the hind feet following in the tracks of the forefeet. So, you know, right away, straightness is not just straight alignment, it might be correct alignment on a curve. But very importantly, beyond that, we require that the horse be pushing equally with the left and right legs, and that we accept an even contact in both reins. Right, so now we're starting to see that the symmetry side of it is going to be quite important next. So typically horses are not straight, are they? Has anybody ever sat on a horse that felt totally straight? Certainly not me. So why do we feel that it's not straight? Well, probably the first thing we notice is that the horse bends more easily in one direction and less easily in the other direction. And these little diagrams here are showing how on the, what we might call the hollow side, or the side that bends easily, you can generally align the horse so that he is, in quotes, straight on the turns and the circles. But on the other side, the horse is more resistant to bending. We call this usually the stiff side, although terminology differs between people. But on the stiff side, the horse is reluctant to bend his body, and he'll often bend it too much in the neck and maybe not enough at the poll to compensate. And then generally one hind leg is the pushing leg, pushes more, and it tends to push the haunches to the side. So you'll often see that the haunches are displaced to the side, and it'll look like the horse is doing this a little bit if you watch him from behind. Right? So the displacement of the haunches is not a uniform bending along the horse's body. It's actually a bending to the behind the saddle in the lumbosacral area that pushes the haunches, as I say, to one side. And then usually the horse will take more contact on one rein. It's easier to, if you like, lighten the horse on the hollow side usually, and the horse will have more contact on the stiff side. So why are horses not symmetrical? And there are all sorts of theories about this. One idea is that it's because we predominantly handle horses on the left side, and especially we mount them on the left side, which puts very asymmetrical forces on the horse's back and legs. But I think generally that theory doesn't really hold water. Right? Some research has been done with horses that were handled ambidextrously from the left and the right versus comparing those with horses that were only handled on the left, and it doesn't really make all that much difference. It doesn't totally explain sidedness, that's for sure. What about the trainer's own sidedness pattern? Sarah's research group have done some studies on this, and they found that typically, or maybe I should say the typical rider, looks like the two diagrams in the middle. The one on the left is straight, the one on the right is how the typical rider is, with the left shoulder down, the left hip up, and collapsing that left hip. That's what we talk about as a collapsed hip, right, when you sit a little bit like this. And it may not be as exaggerated as on those diagrams, but that's typically how riders sit. And of course most people are right-handed, so that probably goes with the right-handedness pattern. Something else that will affect the horse's symmetry for sure is if the horse has previously been lame. You know, when horses are lame, just like us, they get into a different movement pattern. And unless you actually take steps to deliberately change that movement pattern after the horse recovers, then they'll often retain an asymmetrical movement pattern. Okay? So, you know, physical therapy and rehab are very important after injury. A few more reasons for horses not being symmetrical. Their bodies are actually not symmetrical. If you look inside the horse's body, and the picture on the left showing the body organs inside the thorax and the abdomen, the abdominal organs in particularly are quite asymmetrical. This is a view of the left side. If we were to look at the right side, there would be a humongous big cecum there. So, you know, I think that asymmetry in body organ placement may be a part of what we recognize as the asymmetry patterns. Heredity is a possibility, and it's likely to contribute to sidedness in horses. In people, they've shown that it accounts for about 25% of the handedness, leggedness patterns. So a contributing factor, but maybe not the major one. And the one that I think is really important is brain lateralization. Right? All of the sensory and motor nerves from every part of your body project onto a part of the brain. And for most of those nerves, they actually cross over. So your right hand predominantly goes to the left side of your brain. So, you know, I think lateralization of the brain is really important in this context. And of course, that's not something we can actually do much about. What we can do is try to change the sort of end result. So lots more research in people than there is in horses. In people, about 90% are right-handed, 80% right-legged, 70% prefer to use the right eye, and about 60% prefer to use the right ear. Now, we don't usually think about sight and hearing as being sided things, do we? But there's certainly some research to show that even in horses that is the case. Just to give you a couple of examples, if horses are spooked from the left side versus the right side, they'll spook further and keep running further away from the scary object when they get the stimulus in their left eye compared with the right eye. If you play recordings of whinnies to horses, they will listen with predominantly their right ear when it's the whinny of a friendly horse, a horse that they know, one of their neighbors, and they'll listen primarily with the left ear when it's a stranger's whinny. So, you know, horses also have evidence that they have sidedness in their sight and their hearing, just as we do. Now, if the majority of us are right-handed and right-legged, we have various descriptive words that we would apply to the right versus the left hand or leg. So, in the majority of people, the right-handed ones, we say that the right hand or leg is dominant, mobilizing, or more dexterous. So I'm right-handed and I'm right-legged. That means my right hand is the one that I would use to do fine motor skills. And when we put that into the context of riding, just sit there and try your dominant hand and your non-dominant hand. Which fingers is it easier for you to sort of vibrate very sensitively? And generally, the dominant hand is the more dexterous one, so it's the one that actually is easier, you know, to move very fine movements, very sensitive kind of movements. The other limb, the opposite limb, we say subdominant, stabilizing. It's usually the stronger one. If you think about your legs, most people would, as one example, kick a ball with their right leg because that's their subdominant or dominant or more dexterous leg. But at the same time as you're kicking with your right leg, You have to be carrying your body weight, stabilizing your body on the other leg. And I think when we talk about sidedness in horses, probably the best terms out of these to use are stabilizing and mobilizing, because all of the horse's legs are weight-bearing, so it's a matter of which legs are they more stable on and which legs are they maybe less stable but more comfortable moving around. So a few things that we see different on the left and right sides of the horse. Usually one front hoof is bigger and one is slightly smaller. We've already said that they have a stiff side and a hollow side, and that goes along with them having a direction that they prefer to turn in and prefer to bend in. When you're riding horses, for example, on a circle, they tend to fall in on one rein and fall out on the other rein. We're going to look at that a little bit more. Haunches usually don't track straight, and the contact tends to be heavier on one rein. So these are all just signs that the horses are not completely symmetrical on both sides. But one of the problems, and I think something Sarah and I hope to sort of work on and maybe remedy over the next few years, is that we don't have a consistent and universally accepted definition of whether a horse is right-sided or left-sided. And when I read through equestrian texts and the scientific literature, different people use left and right-sided in different ways. And I think that's something that we need to actually work on and get a universal definition for. And the other thing that we really don't know in horses, in people, most people are right-handed and right-legged, the majority of the population. But in horses, we don't know how sidedness in the forelimbs correlates with sidedness in the hind limbs. Are the horses laterally, as in left fore, left hind, doing the same thing, or are they diagonally coordinated as far as their straight side and their more supple side goes? So I hope I'm not infringing on Simon's territory here. But a little bit about what we know about sidedness in horses. Young foals have long legs and short necks, and the kind of horses they're breeding now for sport horses have itty-bitty heads, so it's hard for them to reach the ground when they're young. And I've got a couple of pictures on the left, and the second from the left of strategies that foals sometimes use. The one on the left is splaying his front legs way out to the side so he can get his head down to graze. The next one over is bending his knees so that he can get his head down. But what the majority of horses do is what the next foal and his mother are both doing. They splay their front legs front to back so that they can reach the ground to graze. And it's been shown that foals and adult horses have a preferred leg to put forward and back. So they like to stand in one particular position, and when they move on to the next little piece of grass, they tend to just move on and then stand in that same configuration again. And when they do that, the front foot has got more weight on the heel, and the foot that's back has more weight on the toe. So they tend to develop a flatter foot on the front foot and a smaller, higher heel on the back foot. And the research showed that in a group of foals that were just out grazing for their first 9 months or so of their lives, when they were weaned and brought in, they actually had significant asymmetries in the sizes of their 2 feet. So then these foals were put in big yards with raised hay feeders for the winter, and the asymmetries went away because they weren't having to splay their legs to graze from the ground. So, this is taken as being quite an important aspect of sidedness, and some of the tests that are used in research studies actually evaluate, for example, the horse coming up to a bowl of feed, and how does he end up standing? Right foot ahead, or left foot ahead, and they take that as an indication of the horse's sided preference. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the kind of idea. I hope you can see this picture. Has anybody read this book? Straightening the Crooked Horse? No? It's quite a good book. Lots of interesting ideas in it, and exploring this topic of the asymmetry patterns that we see in horses, and describing the typical left to right asymmetry that we'll come up against in training. So in that book, they describe the typical horse as being right forelimb dominated. And in their definition, the dominant leg, the right forelimb, carries more weight than the left forelimb. The right shoulder falls outwards on the left circle, so when they're circling left, they're drifting out on the right shoulder, and then when they circle right, they're falling in on the right shoulder, okay? And that's their definition of right limb dominant, or right-sided. I think unless you have data from force plate or a pressure map, it's not very safe to assume which leg is carrying more weight. You know, we've always said that when we lunge a horse, the inside legs are weighted more. In fact, now as we do research on that, we find that there's actually more weight on the legs on the outside of the circle. So, you know, I think not safe to make these assumptions, but even if that were correct, if the right forelimb had more weight, then it would be the stabilizing leg, which would go along with a left-sided horse rather than a right-sided horse. And then, you know, you don't need to remember all that. It's just to illustrate that I think we need a universally accepted definition, and we also need more information about sidedness. So what I've been talking about so far is straightness in the horse, but mostly in the context of how the horse is asymmetrical in terms of his body and how he uses his left and right legs. So let's go to the next slide. So there is actually some scientific evidence to kind of back up what they're saying in that book, Straightening the Crooked Horse. So this is a research study that was published a couple of years ago. And what they did in this study was they had foals that were with the mare, and in a round pen, they lunged the mare on the left rein and on the right rein, and the foal was just free to follow the mare as he wanted to. And on the picture of the circle below there, on the left, that is typically how the foals would run around the circle to the left. Whereas to the circle on the right, and that's the picture on the right, instead of going around the perimeter of the circle, they would periodically cut across the circle, right? And that's what this term derailment refers to. It's a word that means they were sort of coming off the rails and cutting across the circle. So these foals that had really never been handled or sort of contaminated by having a person work on their left side, about a third of those foals showed this derailment on the right rein. None of the foals showed it on the left rein. So, you know, right away from a very young age, these foals had a sidedness pattern. Okay. And then I think very much related to that is what we feel as riders, that the typical horse on the left rein, so left shoulder in, right shoulder out, he wants to hug the rail if he's on the rail. If he's just on a circle in the middle of the arena, he'll tend to drift out and make the circle bigger as he goes around it. The shoulders, you'll feel like the shoulders are falling down on the inside of the circle, and there'll be a tendency to overbend the neck. On the right rein, the horse is going to want to fall into the circle and make it smaller. Okay, and that's kind of the equivalent of that derailment that we saw on the last slide. Okay.
So it's my personal belief, not yet backed up by research, but I think that most of what we identify as sidedness in horses is actually due to differences in strength between the left and right pairs of limb pairs, hind limbs or forelimbs. And these differences in carrying and pushing power are what produce not only left-right asymmetries in how the limbs move, but also these left-right asymmetries in how the body is positioned and how the horse performs. I think most of that is coming from these strength differences. And because we're talking about sidedness and symmetry, the differences are going to be most obvious to us when the horses are moving in symmetrical paces. So that would be the walk, the trot, the passage, and the piaffe. In the asymmetrical gaits, the canter and the gallop, of course the differences are still there, but they're a little bit harder for us to see and feel because the nature of the gaits themselves is asymmetrical. And the other thing is that, you know, obviously we work on trying to make the horses more ambidextrous. That's a very important part of our training. And we can achieve that to a certain degree, and part of the message I want to get across to you today is that I think it's really, really important to work on the ambidexterity in the horse, especially in the early stages of training, because if we don't, it's going to come back and haunt us later, particularly in the extensions, in the horses that are in kind of a medium level of training. And then, you know, and what you'll typically see in the extensions is that they'll take a long step, short step with the hind legs, because one hind leg is pushing better than the other one. And then if the horses go on to an advanced level, then you'll start to see the same thing in the passage and the piaffe. And I've got some video later to illustrate that. So I'm going to focus today on the forelimbs of the horse. You know, everybody always talks about the hind limbs, and no doubt the hind limbs are very important. But as we're finding in the research that we're doing at the moment, the front limbs are at least equally important as the hind limbs in all aspects of performance, including collection. Right? And today I'm going to look at some of the effects of the forelimbs in terms of the horse's symmetry pattern. So we talk about the sling muscles of the horse as the muscles that support the horse's rib cage between the two front legs. Horses don't have a clavicle, a collarbone. They don't have any bones connecting the front leg to the rest of the body. So in horses, that connection is entirely due to muscles and ligaments and tendons. And the most important muscle in this, can you maybe just point to the serratus on the left diagram? I could have had that, I guess. Yeah, that muscle right there. It's between, on each side, you've got the horse's forelegs there with the scapula sticking up, and then between the two forelegs is the horse's rib cage, and that serratus muscle is running from the inside of the scapula to the horse's ribs. And that's the most important muscle for holding the rib cage steady, stabilizing it between the front legs. And what happens when that serratus muscle contracts is that the picture looks like the one on the right. So the muscle has got shorter, it's pulled up on the rib cage and actually raised, in this case the withers, this is a section through the horse's withers, actually raised the horse's withers up. So, you know, I'm sure you've all noticed when you get a young horse, often it's a bit mutton withered, you can't see the definition of the withers very well. But then after you've trained it for 6 months or a year, it has quite well-defined withers. And the withers do actually come up higher between the horse's shoulder blades. And I think what happens is that as this sling muscle, the serratus muscle, gets stronger, it retains tone all the time. And that's part of what we think of as good posture in the horse, that they have tone in the serratus muscle and they lift themselves up between the front legs. Okay. Now, what we want the horse to be able to do when he's turning is to use that sling muscle on the side of the leg that's on the ground, and to be able to use it to stabilize and keep the rib cage lifted. But what the horses tend to do on one side is that they slump a little bit. And when they slump, the whole scapula, the shoulder, even the elbow sort of fall to the inside, or to that side, whether it's on the inside or the outside of the circle. So what we're trying to teach the horse to do in terms of the shoulders is to be able to keep the shoulders, the rib cage, supported and vertical, even when the horses are turning or circling. So the picture in the middle is a horse that's coming around on the lunge as horses would choose to turn, with one shoulder pushed into the inside of the circle. And part of our job is to teach the horse how to stand up on that shoulder, lift his rib cage, and then make his rib cage a little bit concave, so to pull the ribs closer together so that the rib cage yields and he gives us a nice place to put our leg and actually sit in there on the inside. And getting the horse to do that symmetrically on the left and right sides is part of our challenge in making the horse ambidextrous. And I think the halt is a very telling movement for looking at the symmetry of the horse. A lot of horses will habitually fall towards the lazy side in the halt, right? So any horse might once in a while lose his balance and step out in the halt. But if you watch the same horse over and over, they tend to have patterns in the halt that we'll look at with the live horse in a minute. And like I say, part of developing them to be more ambidextrous is to be able to halt, move off, and rein back on either leg. And just remember, the stabilizing leg is the one that's used more for support, and the mobilizing leg is the one that it's easier for the horse to move around because he's happier standing on his stabilizing leg. I don't know if those graphs are coming through very clearly, but I can tell you what they show. It's just to show that when the shoulders are asymmetrical, the rein tension becomes asymmetrical. Okay? So the shoulder that's sort of out of alignment, the rein on that side has to follow a longer pathway, and you have higher tension in that rein. And this can be so asymmetrical that if you have the reins with the little stops on for your fingers, and if you know those reins, the stops are at exactly equal intervals on the left and right reins, some horses are so asymmetrical that if you put your fingers on the same stops on the two reins, you'll actually be sitting there with one hand noticeably further back than the other hand. I see someone nodding. Have you seen that? Yes. Okay.
This is Kirsten Queen.
So let's go to our horse now. Do you want to introduce Lindsay? Who's waiting very patiently. I don't think we told you that we were starting a bit late. Yes. Have a look at the people. So, Kirsten, you are the stable manager here.
I am, yeah.
And Lulu is a Bavarian
Warmblood
cross Hanoverian. And she's, did you say 10 years old? 10. And does a bit of everything, but she's competing in medium level dressage at the moment. So we're just letting her have a look at all you funny people and all this equipment that should not be in her arena. So what I'm going to ask Lindsay to do first, now clearly she's owned Lulu for several years and has of course worked on her sidedness problems and made them a lot better. But we're going to ask her first to try and revert to what the normal sidedness is and just go out and ride her on big circles, stay in the middle where we can see you best, on the left rein and the right rein. Okay? And just ride her really sloppy so that she can go into the pattern that she prefers. What does anybody notice in this direction? Kirsten, just spiral in a little bit for us now. Make the circle smaller. Nobody notice anything? Somebody must notice something. It keeps getting a bit bigger. Okay. No.
It's more of a piece, so she's straight, and then it's a bit of an angle, and she's turning it straight. There's no real true curve.
Okay. So can you make it a true circle? And then bring it into maybe 15 meters. Is she bending around the circle? Did I hear a no? Okay. Actually, one of the things in that book, Straightening the Crooked Horse, they sort of equate this sidedness pattern in the forelimbs with being on the forehand. Okay, now we've seen this rein. Could you just change rein and do the same the other way? And watch for the change as she changes direction. And try and decide in your own mind, is this horse hollow to the left or the right? I think Kirsten's done a lot of work on her, but it's not so easy to see as it would be in some horses. So the circle this way, is it tending to fall in or fall out? Is she bending better or not as well in this direction? Okay, let's change the rein once more, Kirsten, and do it so that you change as you're facing the audience. So change it into the circle. And often seeing the change from one direction to the other really gives you a better feel for how she's going. So when she changed the bend there, did she go from straighter to more bent or from more bent to straighter? I think she went from bent to straight. I saw the opposite. Anyone else see what I saw? I think this is the side that she bends more easily to. Is that right? Yes. Okay. So I think we need to ride her on a smaller circle, Kirsten, because clearly you've done a lot of work on straightening her, and that's kind of stuck. So come in front of us here on about a 10-meter circle, just right in here maybe. You ready to go to sitting trot? Even smaller if you can. Yeah, that's better. So how does she feel to you? Which hand has more weight? Which shoulder is she falling on?
She's into my left hand more.
Yep. And which shoulder are you having more trouble?
The right shoulder.
The right shoulder. And this is absolute typical of a horse that's hollow on the right side. So put this picture in your mind's eye. What I'm going to ask her to do in a moment is just to tickle her down that right shoulder with the whip and see if we can stand her up a little bit on that right shoulder. How does that feel? Go a little slower in the speed. Okay, and now just tickle with the whip on that right shoulder. The reason I use the whip to try and straighten up the shoulder is because we don't have a leg right on the shoulder. Eventually you want to replace the whip with a leg in the forward position at the girth. But often just a little touch with the whip, not a punishment, hardly even an aid, just kind of making the horses aware of it is enough to actually activate the muscles and start them lifting that shoulder. Well, does anybody else think she looks better now? Yes. Let's go to the other rein, Kirsten, please. And I'm going to have her keep the whip in the right hand because that's the shoulder that's the problem one. That's the shoulder that she falls onto. On this rein, she tends to drift out onto that shoulder. Can you see that as she goes around the circle, that right front leg a little bit is placed a little bit further out and it points a little bit more outwards rather than turning around the circumference of the circle and pointing along the circumference. So again, we're going to just try using that little bit of whip on that shoulder, keeping her neck straight. And every time you feel her drift out on that right front, just use the whip lightly. And that right front, I can see from here, is starting to follow the circle a little bit better. So now what I'd like you to show us, Kirsten, is the shoulder in. Let's start on the left rein. And can you do it just kind of across and back in view of the audience? So do it first how you would normally do it. No whip, nothing special. What's she doing there? Is she equally bent along the length of her body? Or is she perhaps bending a little too much at the base of the neck? Now, this is the left side that she does not want to bend along the length of her body. And to me, she bends too much in front of her shoulders. She does a lot of the bending with her neck. So the thing that you need to think about here is not moving the inside shoulder in, it's moving the outside shoulder in. And next time you come around, just again, try using a little bit of that whip on the shoulder to help move the shoulder over, the outside shoulder. So think outside shoulder in front of the inside hind, not moving the inside shoulder. Okay? See a difference? Or not? Say not if you didn't. Yes, I see some nods. You just try that once more for us. And really focus on moving that outside shoulder to the left, outside shoulder. And keeping the rhythm fairly slow. And then let's go in the other direction. Do the other shoulder in. So what do we predict will happen in the other shoulder in? Does that one look better? Does, doesn't it? So the challenge on this shoulder in is to take the inside shoulder, we're still mostly working on the right shoulder, and just stand it up a little bit more. So it's supporting a little bit more on the inside. But getting the angle through the angle and the bend through the body is actually easier this way on the horse's hollow side. Okay, let's have a transition to walk. And what I want you to do, Kirsten, is just make a few transitions from walk to halt, just in places where we can see them. And just make several of them, and don't overthink it, just halt. Good. So 3 halts, and every time the horse stabilized on the left front and then moved the right front up. Okay. Do any of you always halt with the same leg moving up last? Can you think it in your mind? I think most of us fall into the horse's pattern, and the majority of horses like to halt by placing the left front and then stepping up with the right front. And I think we do it and feel it so often that we get into that habit too. And it's quite difficult to do it the other way. So let's have Kirsten now see if she can halt by stabilizing on the right front. And it's all in the timing of your half halts coming into the halt. And it's hard to make the change the first few times. That's all right. You should have seen me when I first started working on this. So you have to get the feeling of when to give the half halt, so that that last half halt that says halt is going to stop the right front and then allow the left front to step up. Half halt, and good. She did it. Okay, you get the feel now. So first of all, teach yourself and the horse to be able to do that ambidextrously on the left or the right leg. And then the next step is, which leg do you step off on? Because usually as they move off, they want to stand on the leg that's comfortable for stabilizing and pick up the other one. The same thing if you ask them to rein back. They'll stand on the stabilizing leg and pick up the mobilizing leg. So the easiest way to control that, let's say it's a horse that stabilizes on the left leg, is for you to sit a little bit down and into the right leg, so that you actually sway their weight a little bit onto that right leg, and then that frees up the left leg to be able to move. So let's try that now. Going forward first, see if you can move off with the left leg moving first. So sit down into the right seat bone, forward over that right, there you go, good. Now, it wasn't terribly balanced, was it? But you could tell that Kirsten had done the right thing. She was weighting the right leg, so the left one had to be the first one to move. Very good. Okay, now you have to come and do it into the rein back. Same thing, weight the right front and rein back with the left front first. Very good. You're getting it, aren't you? And you just practice until you can do that whenever you want. You can step into the halt, out of the halt, or into the rein back with either the left or the right leg. And that's, and then actually the next progression from that is to have the horse stand square and then be able to step forward, one step, back one step, forward one step. So rock backwards and forwards on the mobilizing leg. And that's very similar to one of the exercises that we do in the core training from the ground. If you've seen the book, Activate Your Horse's Core, there's an exercise where you have the horse standing square, you put a hand on the middle of the chest, and just have the horse, right, imagine I'm the horse, rock back, rock forward, rock back, rock forward. As they do that movement, they have to use those sling muscles that support the chest and the rib cage between the front legs. They use those muscles to rock their whole chest back and forward, back and forward. So that's a really good exercise for actually recruiting those muscles on both sides. And then, I think the lateral work is good because it's a challenge for the horse to be able to stabilize the rib cage as he crosses the legs over. It's a coordination challenge in terms of turning the muscles on and off on the left and right sides. Well, thank Kirsten very much for her demonstration. That was great.